So I've been wanting to put together a video on reincarnation, and I've been thinking about it for a while. And so to talk about it, I have to talk about a few other closely related topics too. So instead of just reincarnation in this video, it's going to be a little bit more all-encompassing. So oneness, death, and reincarnation is what I'm titling this video. Because in order to really understand the concepts, at least from my bias and from my point of view, we have to talk about those things as well. So, to start things, an essential component is oneness, is realizing that due to the presence of non-separation, the distinction between you and I and you and other people isn't essentially accurate. So, reincarnation, in a sense, especially the prefix re, is kind of a misnomer. Because when we say reincarnation, there's an assumption that there's a life and there's some kind of spirit or consciousness that is on a linear timeline and re-emerging in another form. Fundamentally, that is not, from my perception, that's not quite accurate. So, due to the presence of oneness, all life forms that we are seeing, those are also incarnations of ourselves. So we could call this parallel incarnation. So when I look at you and when you look at me, you're seeing yourself in the other person. So this is parallel reincarnation, parallel incarnation, and that's kind of what I've called it. I don't know of anyone who uses the term like that. There might be, but that's just what I call it. So in that sense, reincarnation is irrelevant. Because the timeline is ultimately irrelevant, because the self exists in a timeless dimension. The timeline therefore doesn't exist, and so, at least in my view, there is this possibility of experiencing life in other forms, which fundamentally, they all exist simultaneously. Again, because of the timeless dimension. So when we think about death, a death of the physical body is is certainly there. That certainly occurs. But ultimately, the self does not die because it is part of this timeless dimension. And in a sense is the timeless dimension. And some people, there is something called past life regression, which I've never done and I have virtually no knowledge about. But my understanding is that people have these experiences with a guide that bring them back, that allow them to experience memories of former lives. I honestly cannot tell you whether or not those are legitimate. They might be. But I honestly do not know. This seems to indicate that, see, from where my vision lies, all lives are experienced by the same consciousness. So really what is happening is not that you are experiencing, that you're remembering a previous life. It's more like you're changing position, you're crossing a four-dimensional, it's almost like a four-dimensional threshold, and witnessing or observing these parallel realities that are there. But it's not that you have this spirit that is proceeding on this linear timeline, and each time you die you incarnate into another one, and then you die and incarnate into another one. It's, at least the way I see it, it's not really like that. Unless you want to indulge in the fantasy of linear time, which I don't. At least not when we're talking about these deeper subjects. You know, if I'm going out to the grocery store and I want to get food, that's a completely different story. But I don't see that. But I don't see that it's linear at all. So with our incarnation, there is sort of a compartmentalization process. where consciousness emerges into a reality or environment with certain rules, and it's a system in place that is defined in a certain way. And this seems to be virtually inescapable as far as I can tell, because while consciousness itself is essentially unbound, it inevitably, in order to experience anything, it compartmentalizes itself in a number of ways. And that's necessary. So, if you want to experience being a human, for instance, it doesn't make sense that you would allow the complete boundlessness of consciousness to flow unhindered, because that means that you're not going to experience what it's like to be human, because being human assumes a number of limitations, which boundless consciousness is relatively absent. Although, as humans, it is possible that we can, get glimpses into it. And so what I see happening is the compartmentalization process is, like a lot of other things that I've talked about, it scales up and down. So the self precipitates thoughts and identification with thoughts like these incarnations have. They're encased in they're bound by certain presuppositions. So when those thoughts are precipitated, we see them and they have a certain this is where it gets a little slippery for me. So my question is only how to describe it. Think of thoughts like bubbles that are arising to the surface of a pool. And these thoughts are precipitated by a more fundamental presupposition and set of beliefs. So each thought bubble is a system, an environment in and of itself. And in the same way, our incarnation as a human form is much the same way. Only it's much more, it's far, far, far more substantial. And so instead of the human form precipitating a thought, our expanded self precipitates the human incarnation. This is just at least the way I see it. So death doesn't ultimately exist for the self. It does exist for the physical body. So what do we reincarnate into when the physical body is gone? So again, because it's not linear, it's not technically something that occurs after your physical body is gone. So in a sense, you could think of it like the incarnation that you will incarnate into after this body is dead is already existing. So the self that is rendering this dimension is also rendering the dimension of self that exists, what you think is after this body dies. But that's not quite it. So the amount of complexity that is here is virtually infinite. And what is that incarnation? I don't know. I've come to the conclusion that, reincarnation is inescapable, although I have no idea what, the next, again, I say next, but only in relative terms, what the next reincarnation could be. I don't think that can really be predicted, because it appears that that is primarily up to the expanded self, not just the human ego-identified self with its personality and its beliefs and quirks and characteristics. But I am under the impression that you are in full control. But when we think you or I, the one that's in control, we just have to recognize that it's more of a complete sense of self that is in control. Some people ask, do I have to come back here? Because well, a lot of people beg the question of, karma and having to come back to planet Earth to do work and grow their understanding. I really never in my time devoted to studying the self, karma just never really occurred to me to consider it as a legitimate philosophy. Now, in the beginning, that's because, I grew up in a Christian household, not one that I grew up in a Christian culture. That's more accurate. So the idea of karma is just isn't there. I live in America, and for the most part, people in this culture they don't talk about it, they don't teach about it, and they don't learn about it. But by the time I came to the conclusion that reincarnation was something of a reality in one sense or another, the idea at that point of karma just already fell off the discussion table. Karma ultimately, here's the kicker. Karma is as real as we believe it to be. And again, it's not necessarily what our current human understanding believes it to be, but what the more expanded entire self requires of us. Did that make sense? I'm not sure it did. So to me, karma is kind of irrelevant. I don't really think about it. I'm particularly in the more dogmatic sense. Like I've heard people characterize karma as something like sort of like they're scoring brownie points and you're accumulating these points, and when you do something bad, you generate bad karma, and when you do something good, you generate good karma. And this is a complete binary and a value system. And it's based in a naive perception of reality. And I hope that doesn't sound pretentious, but as far as I can tell, that's just what it is. Because it's lacking a lot of consideration. So for one thing, the perception of good behavior is completely subjective and can change over time. And can easily change over time within ourselves. So something that I thought that I did that was good a week ago or a year ago or 10 years ago could completely change in any amount of time. And so the good bad binary is only useful in case scenarios where we have a certain set of information And based on that information, we can arrive at certain conclusions. You know? So good and bad, we can forget about that. It's not relevant. But I think what's more important is what we're generating in the present moment. So if my goal is to love other people unconditionally in every moment-to-moment circumstance, I would say that's a better value system than having a rule book of what constitutes good and bad and basing our behavior off of that. Because that's how we get things like crusades, you know? You have religious people who they know that they have divinely inspired wisdom. And because these infidels are not behaving in this way, then I can justify acts of cruelty and violence upon them. And that is considered good. But is it filled with love? Well, maybe it's filled with unconditional love. And only unconditional love on an absolutely profound level that our normal human perception is just incapable of understanding. But to me, it's not really relevant. That's not why we're here. Why we're here, in my perception, seems to be to learn how to, well, this is one reason. Aside from just learning and having these experiences and creating a juxtaposition for a more expanded self to create its own reality, one of the reasons why we're here is to learn how to love unconditionally. And when someone loves you, that's easy to love them back. It's real easy. And I think Jesus and the Bible made a few, references to that. It's like, what credit does it provide you to love someone who loves you, So unconditional love is the thing. And I guess that's maybe trailing off a little bit, but I think it is related to the broader discussion that we have going here. So my perception is that our incarnations, it does seem to be very free form, and there is much of what occurs is dependent upon our beliefs. And so what I perceive to be a very open environment of incarnation, perhaps it's something a little different for other people. I will give the idea of karma some credit, and one of those ideas is that And I only give it credit in a very broad understanding. That is that you will continue to repeat mistakes until you understand what is fundamentally causing them, or until you at least recognize that you have a choice in the matter. And I guess those two kind of go hand in hand. And that does seem to be the case. But there's also another perception of that too, it's not just that you'll continue to make mistakes over and over until you see that that's kind of a pessimistic vision of the process. But really, it's just the same process that allows any sort of repetition, good or bad. But so often the idea of karma is tooled in discussions about reincarnations. And in those discussions, people generally want to become inspired to control or manipulate those incarnations. And so they ask the question, well, what is holding me back? And so they frame karma in this very unpalatable sense. If you've heard Dolores Cannon, if you've seen any of her videos on YouTube, which I don't really recommend, then there's a lot of framing karma in that way, and I don't think it's ultimately useful at all. Nor do I think it's necessarily true. But I submit that if you strongly believe in karma, then perhaps that's what you'll get. But I wouldn't have too much concern about that.